Welcome to the Thinking in Between podcast, where we explore the borderlands of health and social science. In each episode, we ask someone working within this space to bring 3 ideas that have most changed their thinking and practice. And today, I'm glad to be joined by Louise Younie, who is Professor in Medical Education at Queen Mary University of London. Louise's interests are in using creative inquiry methodologies in medical education for humanising medicine, professional identity formation, and human flourishing. Would you be able to start just by introducing a little bit about your background and how you've arrived at doing what you're doing now?
Yep. So went through medical school, believed that becoming a doctor was about learning to diagnose and treat disease, and had quite a black and white view on that. Thought I might do orthopaedic surgery, thought that might fit, and found myself in general practice, didn't quite fit. But again, wanted a sort of black and white, wanted to avoid the grey. But when I started listening to patients, I realised that it really wasn't possible. And at that point, I also became an educator. And so I started exploring, how do we help, how do we engage with the messiness and complexity, and how do I help future clinicians to do so? And that's where I got into starting to look at using the arts in that space.
Great. And your role now, do you mind just saying briefly a bit about that, putting in context?
Yeah, so I've been an academic for both a GP and an academic for over 20 years. Now I'm Professor of Medical Education, and what I mainly am employed for is faculty development of our GP educators, teaching out in practice. But I also have a passion around humanising healthcare and medical education. Humanising the medical education for patient-centred care was where I started. And as I humanised the patients, I realised that the students were being humanised, and I started exploring a move from resilience towards flourishing.
Brilliant. And we're going to come back to flourishing as the third idea that you're going to bring today, and looking forward to talking about that. Thank you. And the first idea that you've chosen is Paolo Freire's liberation pedagogy. So would you be able to introduce us to Freire's work and then say a bit about how it's influenced your thinking and practice?
Yeah, so he's a Brazilian pedagogue, if you like, who his ideas have been very powerful across education thinking, and he wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He actually experienced his own poverty himself. And I think from having, as a child, and from having experienced that, he understood the value of liberation and learning for liberation. And so one of the big ideas is around the banking model. And so a more traditional teaching method might be, this is the knowledge, I'm the teacher, I'm the expert, I'm going to tell you the knowledge, you're going to, like sort of putting something in the bank, and you're going to put it in your bank, and then you'll be able to regurgitate it in the test that I check that you've learnt what I've said. He's proposing more that you centre the problem. And so you would have the student and the educator with a more flattened hierarchy, both in positions of being able to learn with and from each other, rather than it being a unidirectional approach. And this mirrors, in lots of ways, the power dynamics with patients as well, so or what we hope that our students will, how they'll be with our patients, so that I often talk about the patients being the experts of their lived experience, which means that the two of us need to come together and have a conversation if we're going to do something useful from the clinical and the patient side. And similarly with the students, they are the experts of how any teaching that we do lands. And when we work together and think about what kind of learning spaces we make, I think that we can grow understanding both ways. I think I do very little telling actually. Most of my learning spaces, I'm involved in faculty development and bringing the creative methods into thinking about, first of all, person-centred care, but then also human flourishing for students. And so most of the sessions that I do are dialogical, and dialogue is actually another of Paolo Freire's key concepts, this idea that across a flattened hierarchy and that sort of talk, that dialogue is very powerful for learning. So, for example, the creative inquiry sessions that we do, that I've even just come from with my students, we bring ideas. I might start with an idea like the wounded healer, and throw it out there with some quotes, and then the students will be talking about what that might mean to them, how that impacts them, how they're thinking about what their experiences are as a year 2 medical student. And so I've learned a lot of new things today about being a second year medical student and how this work lands with them, how little space there is actually in a curriculum to just actually talk or even connect or get to know each other.
How does one kind of adopt this sort of pedagogical approach that Freire puts forward in a medical system that feels like it's got to stuff students full of facts?
I mean, the way I'm thinking about it is that there is a place and space for learning facts, but that doesn't need to be 100% of that place and space. And so the practice that they're going to do in the end is with people, and understanding something about people as well as how we use our medical facts is essential, really. So I feel like in any educational session, there is space for that. So even if we're just trying to teach core facts, there is space for trying to understand what the students understand about that, how they're making sense of it, because what I tell them isn't the same as what they understand and take away. So that's on the most kind of factual level. But when we start talking about the complexities of ethics or what's happening for patients in the moment, what they might be thinking, or how we presence ourselves alongside suffering, there's so much space potential. If people are going to change, they have to have a chance to hear themselves thinking and have those conversations. I guess that sort of sits in with constructivism as a way of thinking, rather than the positivist approach of like, we'll tell you this and this is what you take away.
Yes. And you spoke as well about patient experts in this sort of way of teaching. And I'd be just interested to hear of any examples that stand out to you where you've seen change in students who come to learn from, or yourself even come to learn from a patient expert.
Yeah, so so again, this happened this week. I invited one of our patients who actually met in a lighthouse as part of being a trustee for Arts and Health Southwest organisation. So I didn't know him as a patient, but he's a patient with MS, but also an artist. And he speaks into the Flourishing space as well. And he talks about his journey and how his journey was disrupted by illness. And there came a moment where he had, because of the illness, basically, he had a moment of crisis. This potentially it is transforming my life, and what can I do in it? And actually moved to becoming an artist. So empowered himself, and has actually now is actually grateful for that transition, in that he's doing so much artwork and wouldn't have moved in that field otherwise. And so there's the learning about his human experience. There's a learning about the amazing, it comes out with just such an amazing quotes. And so for me, I'm particularly interested in creativity. So this isn't necessarily in medicine, but one of the things that's really sat with me in this last week is he was encouraging the students just to do stuff creative. Just do it, don't worry, just get started. And he says, if you start being creative, inspiration will come out to meet you. But also I asked him at the end of the session, for our students as well, what advice would you give us as future clinicians or clinicians? And he spoke into 3 areas that are close to my heart, actually, which is why I remember it so well. But one was about attending to your patient and listening in a way that, how powerful that is, just to be listened to as a person rather than passed off as a sort of set of symptoms. So powerful. And he also talked about being able to share stories where people can connect and hear stories. And he also talked about hope and enabling or engendering some kind of hope.
Thank you. I'm interested as well to hear about whether there's any sort of connection, I guess, with the title of the book's intriguing, of the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I guess, what's the link, as far as you see it, between this approach to teaching and the recognition and the resistance to oppression?
So one of the areas is around epistemology, also what we call knowledge, and the valuing of lived experience. And so when I say that the student is expert of lived experience, they might be at the bottom of the hierarchy, but there is an expertise that they have by the virtue of what they're experiencing. And in a sense, they're not necessarily oppressed, although, you know, we all experience different amounts of oppression within society, depending on, you know, where we're coming from and what privileges we have. And so another key concept is this critical consciousness and developing of critical consciousness. So he doesn't think education is about learning some stuff and being able to regurgitate it. He thinks it's about transforming society. So education, he thinks, is, you know, essentially for making things better. And in particular, the voices that are unheard in society are the oppressed voices. And so those oppressed voices need to be liberated. And can be liberated when they're given space. And there's one example, I can't remember, but he actually taught a load of people from the field to read very, very quickly. You know, so, and often, I guess, in society, people get kind of stuck in positions and they're thought to then not be able to do more. But I think his belief is, and mine is as well, that people are amazing, actually, and being given spaces and opportunities can really step into that. So, for example, then with my students today, and I was wondering whether I should continue trying to do this work with the creative inquiry because it's so hard to get the space. And the students coming in and talking about different parts of the curriculum and where and how we could make spaces for this kind of work. And the work is a lot around finding the voice, you know, of the human self that might be more vulnerable and fragile, that is often suppressed, and people become lonely and isolated in that. Because you then end up thinking, I'm the only person who's like this. But when we create spaces for even our oppressed voices, if you imagine, you know, amongst all of us, I think there's a real strength to that. You know, it's a different kind of strength, that strength of vulnerability. So rather than trying to think that we have to be strong and macho and perfect, we realise that we are actually human and there's a space for that. So it's kind of tackling that oppression and becoming critically conscious. Of course, it might tie into EDI stuff, or, you know, all of those different areas of social justice issues. And that's all really important to know about as clinicians working with patients who may have experienced trauma and injustices of all kind, but also for ourselves and within our profession. So it's kind of giving voice to a part of us and a part of our experiences that is often suppressed. And I believe it gets into the complexity of practice. And he talks about praxis and, you know, the sort of where the thinking and the acting comes together. I don't know, does that?
Yeah, no, it's great. And we don't think of that in teaching, because teaching often seems like, well, it's just teaching. It's a good thing. You know, we take for granted that that oppression isn't involved. But I think in the way that you describe it in Freire's work, you can see that even in a kind of relatively place where people have relative power, like medical students, there is still the possibility of reinscribing oppression in the way that we go about teaching it in a medical school.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that is true for some people's experience, particularly if they are struggling for any different reasons. And we were talking today, actually, again, with the students that, you know, what you can learn through those times of struggle in terms of bringing to your understanding of patients' struggles, and why it might be so valuable to actually nurture and make space for those rather than exclude anyone that's going through difficult times, and for some of those voices to be released for everyone else to hear. Is very powerful, I think. You know, sometimes they say that doctors, you know, if doctors go through being ill and experiencing how vulnerable it is, or what it's like to have no power in a situation, that may transform their thinking about their own clinical practice. And maybe we can't make that happen for everybody, but maybe we can make a space for different people to be able to voice some of this stuff so that we start to get a sense of those experiences.
Thank you. Is there anything else you want to say about this first idea before we move on?
Maybe just around humanisation as well. So the more I kind of read or see in this journey of exploration for myself, so I've been just writing a book chapter on the human dimension, and I find that Paolo Freire has also written so much into humanisation and valuing the human that overlaps with all of this work. So And I guess that's part of what it is valuing the reality and lived experience of a holistic way of thinking about human. And so that so overlaps with how we want to think about our clinical practice. And yet we talk about it, but we're struggling to find ways to, I think, one, to educate for that holistic understanding, but two, to make spaces for it within the systems that we work in afterwards as well.
It strikes me that if one teaches medical students in a way that doesn't feel very human, then you're almost communicating more powerfully a message about whether it matters or not to treat people as human than any kind of bolted on conversation at the side. Like the method screams out some sort of message there.
Totally, the medium is the message, basically. And that's what I've always been powerfully struck by, is if I want them to be person-centred and to value the patient's lived experience, surely I need to show them what that looks like when they're relatively not in power and I'm relatively sort of in power, that I need to empower them in that way. And I think that should have more impact probably than all the lectures and talks you might do about being compassionate or anything else.
Thank you so much. The second idea that we're going to speak about today is on epistemic humility. Would you be able to explain what epistemic humility is and why it's important to you?
Yeah, and maybe I should start with epistemic injustice, which is a sort of related concept that Freire has written about, which is that idea of an injustice where we are not recognising someone's capacity as a knower. And that's a risk that we might do to patients, that's a risk we might do to students. So we disempower them, we reduce their agency. And there are different kinds of epistemic injustice. So Freire describes testimonial, where we're not really valuing because of our judgments on the person who's telling what they're saying. And then there's a hermeneutic injustice, which is more like where there isn't the language to express it. And one of the ways I think about it is, a patient who's got bodily symptoms and they're trying to say, that it's not so easy for them to say, we've got a whole language set up on our diagnosis stuff, but it's not that easy for them to put into words, perhaps, what they've got going on.
Yes.
But they give other examples, like in the 60s and sexual harassment there wasn't really language for it, and so that's the example that I've read elsewhere. It's hard then to say what's happening when there's not really the language.
Yes.
So then epistemic humility or narrative humility was a concept that I first kind of came across in a paper by Dasgupta when I was doing my doctoral research, and that idea that we can't fully understand someone else's story. Epistemic humility, I think, just takes that a little bit broader, and it's particularly valuable for medical professionals because there's a risk that we are trained to think that we know what's going on and that we are going to tell the patient what's going on. And epistemic humility means that we have a bit more understanding about different ways of knowing, and that we might appreciate that, for example, that a lived experience way of knowing is actually a valid way of knowing. And there's validity in that. It's not that the patient is subjective and I'm objective and I'm going to tell them how it is. So it just flattens that hierarchy again, and it makes a space where I can continue to learn from patients and hopefully, a valuable space for patients.
Thank you. I wonder, are there any examples of, just to kind of help those who aren't familiar with the idea of epistemic injustice and how it might play out, are there any examples you've seen either in your role as a clinician or as an educator where epistemic injustice might be present, aside from what you mentioned about patients sometimes there not being the language to explain what they're experiencing in their body? Are there any other occasions or situations?
I think there's so much. So the whole field of so trauma is, so it's a growing field, isn't it? Then more and more people are talking about trauma-informed care. But I didn't have any training or understanding on that as I came through into being a GP. And I guess the more that you're aware of that, the more you're able to be in that space and hear about people's trauma, the more validity you can offer in that space. So I think that we do for example, let's take personality disorder. Maybe this is contentious, but there's a lovely paper around the triple F of having a personality disorder. And so first of all, you have the you experience trauma, and then you get the mental health and physical problems from it, and then you get a healthcare professional telling you you've got a personality disorder, there's like something fundamentally wrong with you, rather than that you're having normal responses to very difficult circumstances. So I find myself spending quite a bit of time when people tell me all these things and feel like they're a failure and feel like, but then when you hear some of the stuff they've lived through, it's like, wow, I mean, you're a survivor. You actually must be really strong to be here. And I remember like a patient sort of saying that the next time I spoke to her, I said that sort of stuff to her, and she went and told all her friends, and said it. I mean, it didn't solve all her problems, obviously, but she said a massive weight was taken from her shoulders. She still needed, ongoing medication stuff, but just as a slight reframing as how we think about ourselves.
Yes.
So I think that there's so much epistemic injustice, and I think I have a growing sense of just, with increasing poverty and with increasing, I guess it's easy for a doctor to think, why doesn't that patient stop smoking? Why don't they take my advice on their diabetes? They obviously don't care about themselves and, make all kinds of judgments. But if we were living their life and knew how difficult it was, worrying about, I don't know, finances or whatever, we would be... So I feel like all of that, I feel like there's so much, it's like, yes. I don't even know, so many, and I'm sort of reframing as I'm going on, kind of reframing more and more of what I see. Of course, in our 10-minute consultations, it's very difficult to... so that's the injustice to the doctors that are trying to do something in that space that isn't unjust. So it's tricky.
Yes, and in the medical school setting, I wonder if has that kind of concept of epistemic humility, come into the way that you teach, or I don't know, when you see how teaching is arranged and organised, is that useful to speak to any of how we go about medical education?
So QM wants to be the most inclusive university, we are in a place of very widening participation. And even just been doing a collaborative autoethnography with some students, and we ended up talking about some fifth year students who've just qualified, about their experiences, and part of what came up was around widening participation and how you might come in on this widening participation into medical education, but then a sense of maybe being dropped or not having ongoing support, or being looked down on, like people have talked about being looked down on when they said they've come from certain areas, rather than actually being respected for how have you managed to get here, like all on your own with everything stacked against you. So there's that understanding where our students are coming from, and thinking about ways in which we can support people that are more on the back foot, that don't have friends, family, people, whatever in the profession, or haven't had people that have gone to university. And then I think I think the whole way we're thinking about teaching, one can think of it so many different ways, like compassion in assessment, and how we're using the assessments and how we're communicating around assessment results. And there's lots of space for us to grow in our sense of using it. And I think for me it's a lot about, I've started recently thinking about creative agency, and so the creative agency of our patients, so not necessarily just plopping anyone who seems to be depressed on an antidepressant. I'm not saying not to use it, we might, it's part, but actually how do we enable their creative agency as part of a healing process? And maybe we need to enable the creative agency of our students in order for them to be able to enable the creative agency of our patients.
Yeah, and I'm just struck by your description of the student who's maybe come through the widening participation scheme to start with, and I guess that being looked down on is not just an injustice in terms of misrepresenting what they've gone through, but it's actually also, I guess, sort of a silencing or a marginalisation of what, like, some knowledge they have and something they've learnt along that journey that will be actually completely absent from the knowledges of some of their peers and some of us who are involved in education, and I guess that feels like perhaps where epistemic justice might be there too.
Yeah, and so there's the idea of reverse mentoring, and I feel like I was reverse mentored, for example, by a student who did a year 4 project with me, which is like an 8,000 word assignment, writing about volunteering and actually how good it is for you, but actually if you're coming, if you have to work because you can't afford not to be working, you have no chance to volunteer and have that kind of benefit of volunteering. So reverse mentoring actually is a great process, I think, to be, and I'd like to see more of that across for other students and also for educators.
What is it? Sorry,
reverse mentoring. So that idea that people who are in some way, shape or form on the back foot do have much more understanding of what that is like, and so they bring that education. So we need to be educated, a bit like the Black Lives Matter movement. There's a lot of education that started happening for people that have just never really thought about it, never needed to think about it. So that's reverse mentoring. And I guess we can choose to set that in place. Also, there's research to show that students coming from widening participation have a lot. I think I read this in my students' writing, but in her assignment, that they bring a lot to medical education because they bring lots of perspectives and understanding of patients that other people wouldn't have necessarily. And so we need a medical education, I think, that really celebrates and welcomes that diversity of perspective and honours and respects, rather than is either threatened by or looking down on.
Yes. I wonder if I could ask about how epistemic humility, I don't know, whether that concept was something you came across during your experience as a patient, and whether there's anything of this concept that speaks to either your experience or what you would have wished for at that time.
Maybe what I would have wished for. I mean, I'm really happy to be alive, like I wouldn't be otherwise without the treatment, and I did meet lots of very lovely doctors along the way. But when I had my own medically unexplained symptoms, which weren't in the literature that you would have. So I had palpitations with the chemo, and very definitely, very badly after the next few days after I had chemo. And I was kind of told that doesn't happen with this medication. And so, it was assumed. I ended up going in, and it was assumed that it was because I was anxious. The problem was the thing was I was anxious 24/7. I was anxious all of the time. I had a 5-month-old baby. I was anxious all the time. That I wasn't. My 2 aunts died of it. I was anxious. But after the chemo, I had palpitations. And I suppose I wasn't, what I would have preferred would be, it doesn't say in the notes that people suffer with this, but it seems like you are. We're not sure what we can do about it, but from the past, it feels like it maybe got better over the next couple of days. Just be with me and it be okay about not knowing. You don't have to dismiss the patient. So, yeah.
Yes.
So that's my biggest example, I suppose.
Yeah, wow.
But not wanting to complain.
No,
I feel grateful, really
absolutely.
grateful to the medical profession.
But that's naming, I think that's naming something so important, isn't it, of the everyday epistemic injustice that can happen in that power dynamic, where even for you who holds quite a lot of power compared to a lot of people in that situation, even then your authority as a knower to say, I'm experiencing this in my body. I don't think it's anxiety because that's not
all
there.
All the time, yeah.
Can I ask what did those words, when the person said, I don't think it's, or even worse, it isn't this. What do words like that do in that moment? What did they do?
Well, I think I heard the senior house officer, as they were called then, whisper to the nurse, because I think my heart rate went down slightly when I lay down. Said, "Oh, it's all it's all in her head," or something like that. And also the nurse took my heart rate, and I'd probably go at 60 normally, and it was 80, lying. And she's like, "Oh yeah, it normally goes on at 80, doesn't it?" No, but actually mainly I was so vulnerable. I just remember lying there thinking, I was in your shoes. I have been an SHO. I was in your shoes. You have no idea that I was in your shoes, and I've sort of done that. But there's nothing in me that can say anything right now. I feel so vulnerable. So I guess, I just connected with that huge vulnerability and not being able to, I guess I've been struck again and again about how little I feel. I can say a very short example might be I go in for checkups now after as part of a cancer trial. Right. And I'm so grateful again, for all of that. And very lovely, kind nurses would say to the doctor when they said, what has she come in for? And I'm sort of trying to ignore the fact that I have had cancer in a way, but, or to check for recurrence. And they're not meaning to be unkind. But it wasn't until one particular nurse had looked up the research findings and had engaged with me a bit more that I actually dared to say anything about it. And she was very gracious. But, it's interesting, I didn't feel that I could actually, I winced every time they said it, but I didn't feel like I could feed that back.
Yes.
You are so on the back foot as a patient,
yes.
in general.
Yes. Wow. What practices do you think we can employ, I guess, how might we make space for epistemic humility in our interactions with patients?
I think there's a shift of consciousness, and maybe that's the Paolo Freire sort of, raising consciousness that actually there are different ways of knowing. And, if we were dealing with a robot that was that there was an exact right answer, then how we do things would be right. And, the randomized double-blind controlled trial would be the gold standard, and that's all excellent. But if we are dealing with human beings that are arguably body, soul, spirit, to only take a biomedical view is actually less scientific, I think, than trying to have some kind of human connection. So for me, it's more, it makes more sense to think, how can I help you, rather than what is your diagnosis? Because at the end of the day, there's a problem. This is Paolo Freire, there's a problem, and we're both coming to look at it. If I tell you something that you disagree with, or you're not interested in, or it's not, then that's a total wasted consultation. It's a waste of time. So, I guess it's that movement from soft stuff, which people call the stuff that isn't,
right.
Which is actually the hard stuff. We can look up the facts, we can ask someone about the facts, but when you've got an interaction that's not working well, it might be because I'm doing something. So I talk about reflexivity quite a bit with the students. We start to see the lenses and the power and how we're holding, how we position other people. So I guess it's a growth thing, isn't it? Yeah. So I think we can grow in humility and not fearing the mess, and but our systems don't always support us in that.
Yes.
And it is hard to do so also, particularly with litigation.
I wonder, just on that note of what you were saying there, of how some of the work that you're involved in, that others involved in, around the soft stuff, as it gets sort of categorized as, I guess particularly working in a medical school, and this is maybe something that comes up around research as well, and I think it might well be the case in education too, that there's maybe a certain types of knowledge are in a hierarchy,
yes.
And certain are kind of
Definitely.
admissible as like, this is the knowledge that matters, or either in terms of research, this is the knowledge that's kind of publishable, that kind of can be practice changing. This is the sort of knowledge in a medical school that's examinable, or that's kind of core curriculum, and then this is the sort of knowledge that's the sprinkles, the soft stuff. Yeah. What I guess I'm struck by the fact that may sometimes be another form of epistemic injustice, and I wonder how you found operating in that space, where that's something you've worked at and worked within for a long time now.
Yeah.
What's that like to work alongside that sort of epistemic injustice?
It's not very easy. It's it's difficult to put stuff into words. It's difficult. It's difficult to have traction, and I'd say probably for the first 18 years it was, although there were people that I did kind of connect with and that thought similarly, it was quite a lonely journey, and I have experienced where people have thought, people in power have thought this is just about this is the same as just going to the cinema to relax or something, whereas for me, bringing in the creative inquiry, so exploring our lived experience through the arts, actually I think develops practice, is really invites transformational educational experience. And so I feel like the students have often understood that, but the powers that be haven't necessarily. So I guess there's a sense of silencing, and maybe around the time of COVID, it felt like suddenly people were there was a bit more traction, and I think the work around human flourishing has now had maybe a lot more traction. So I find that I am now invited in educational settings to a number of keynotes across different medical schools and stuff. So that has kind of exploded in a way. But for the first 18 years, it felt like, what is she doing?
Yes. Yeah, wow. Is there anything else you want to say about this idea of epistemic humility before we move on?
Yeah, I think that's...
So the final idea that you've brought today is a concept that you've been central to developing, and it's the idea of flourishing spaces. So maybe to start with, if you could talk a bit about what you mean by flourishing, and in particular how it contrasts with or somewhat aligns with the idea of resilience, and then to explain what you mean by flourishing space.
Yeah, so maybe if I start with resilience, if that's okay, which is a term that has been researched and written about in medical education and healthcare education sort of more and more. So in the last 20 years really, it's gained a lot of ground, and particularly through COVID. And the idea is that idea of toughing it out, really. And it can be a useful concept, but it also can do quite a bit of harm. So some of the issues that I have with the concept of resilience is in material science, it's how much a material can take until it breaks.
Wow.
So to use that for our inner life, how resilient are you, feels like not a good metaphor for my inner life. And in the Latin, it means resiles, to spring back or rebound, which again, I don't know, I've been through a cancer experience myself, so that's probably the worst experience I've been through, and there was definitely no springing back or rebounding. There was a sort of growing around it, but it wasn't any kind of rebounding back to that same shape. And you get these brief resilience scales that kind of just take no account of what people are going through, and it's like, how much can you take and bounce back from sort of 0 to 5. It feels like it's not very critical, but it's not really very fair, it's actually, and I would always say to the students, it took more strength for me to get dressed and go and see a doctor when I was in the cancer situation than it does for anything that I do now, but I would have scored terribly on this brief resilience scale.
Yes.
So it just doesn't feel like a good measure and approach. And actually people have talked about it even resilience shaming for doctors, or almost being abusive. And I think it's, if you try to deal with the problems in a system by looking at individual resilience and sort of blaming clinicians for not being able to stand up to what is toxic around them, that's really problematic. And so quite a lot of doctors, when I present it, feel quite angry with it. If I say, how does it land with you? Are you resilient? It makes them feel quite angry. So flourishing is an opportunity to think perhaps in a different way. It's not well defined in the medical literature. It's not been drawn on that much, although there's an increasing interest in it across all fields. I'd say it's an old but a new concept. So Aristotle talked about hedonia, which is the sort of, eat some chocolate, makes yourself feel good. But also eudaimonia, which used to be translated as happiness, but now is translated as flourishing, which is around meaning and purpose, so purposeful action. So, when you've had a really good consultation with a patient and you know that it feels like you've really, that you've made a difference being there, that is a kind of eudaimonia feeling. And so I've kind of got in there, and I've been, basically, because I started trying to humanize the patients for our students through the arts, and as I did that, I realized that the students were being humanized, and somehow within all of that, I started to see how resilience wasn't making sense, and
Right.
when we were thinking about their humanity, I ended up finding sort of the concept of flourishing, which metaphorically feels like it's much more ecological and spacious. You're thinking gardens, you're thinking compost, you're thinking what's your weather system is like. There's lots of reasons for why we might be feeling in different ways at different times. And I've created a flourishing model from the work with students, which includes, as many flourishing models do, compassion and, meaning making and relationship. But none of them include shadow work, as far as I have found. And I draw on Jung's concept of shadow work there, which is like basically engaging with stuff that's difficult in our lives or in ourselves. And what I find is when we create spaces that are safe for students, they start to share things that may be difficult, like imposter syndrome, like perfectionism, which we know are two key drivers for poor mental health. And as they share those sorts of things, we haven't changed anything. So this isn't the well-being of go for a run, eat well, sleep well. We know that's all good. But actually, this is more about the well-being of connecting with other people, of building trust, of hearing that you're not strange or different to other people, that actually we all have things that we struggle with. We're all a bit broken in different ways. So I've started exploring flourishing with students often through using the arts, because I find that our human dimension comes out much more rapidly as you take a risk through some kind of creative expression and sharing.
That's wonderful. Can you say a bit more about what happens in those, I guess the link between creativity and exploring flourishing there?
So when students so one of my students said a number of years ago, I invited them to do some kind of, I always start with easy things first because people worry about exposing themselves, so some kind of doodle or whatever it was. And before she shared it in the group, she said, actually this is difficult to talk about because you can't be creative without putting something of yourself in it. And so in that, what happens is if you have a group of students, and I try to operate in a sort of, I call it vulnerable leadership. I've written about that idea of holding it with vulnerable leadership and psychological safety. So we look at process rather than product. We talked a lot about what kind of engaging with the creative process in some kind of playful, explorative way. If the product is beautiful or nice and you appreciate it, that's great. But if it isn't, it's not really about that. So I try to move into that thinking. And then what happens in the group is usually one person, through their creating, because it marries up, whether you want to say right or left brain or mind and soul or mind and heart or however you want to think about it, it somehow makes you holistic. I've not found any other way to get into that holistic space, and people start telling stories and they start speaking from their own perspectives, and they'll take small risks in that group. And as they take risks, then another person will take risks and they share more and more. So in this creative arts student select component that I've run for 20 years, people will say at the end, we're an amazing group of students, or I've got to know myself better in the last 2 weeks than I have in my 21 years. So it creates a space, the process can be therapeutic. They were talking today about it feeling therapeutic. The process can be therapeutic. You can get into flow just like doing the creative stuff. But also the sharing is very therapeutic. Does that make sense?
And the term flourishing space then, is that to describe a space like that creative arts module, or what would a creative space encompass?
So that's kind of the latest thinking that we've started to get onto, and we're starting to research and think about, because so some people talk about flourishing. For example, there's a Harvard model that talks about flourishing. They measure it, and it's kind of as a noun. If you measure well on your housing situation, your work situation, financial situation, then you're flourishing. I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in flourishing as a verb, as Sarah Willen and other people write about. She's a critical anthropologist. But this idea of flourishing as a verb, as a way of travelling, as a way. So it's not that everything's perfect. It's not that it's all beautiful, but actually we are growing, we are connecting, we're exploring, we're curious, we are alive. So then rather than focusing too much on the individual, started thinking about the space in which we find ourselves and what does a flourishing space look like. So in Sarah Willen's research, she did research in the Midwest US, and found that certain races and certain people of certain financial categories were less likely to say they're flourishing. And so she's kind of calling out, what are those barriers? And I guess I've become interested in that as well. So there are barriers to people's flourishing. So how do we, if you are the person in power, or how do we create flourishing spaces? So it can be anywhere. And we're just kind of trying to conceptualize it. But I think about it like this, what would it mean for it to be a flourishing space for the patient to come into me? What might make that a flourishing space? What does a flourishing space in higher education look like? And I think it can be, it doesn't have to be, but it could be that creative sort of space that I've just described. But it could be all sorts of other spaces as well. And what does it look like in healthcare? What does that look like for clinicians, for example? And I don't think that, we're not going to be in flourishing spaces all of the time, but I do think we probably as human beings need some flourishing spaces along the way. So I almost imagine the medical curriculum with like a thin blue line and then little clusters of oases where the students can come and drink. I have a real sense that they're so sort of parched and so thirsty and so end up potentially so disconnected.
Right.
That these are spaces where you could be, you could connect, you could find community, you can hear yourself think. But it's hard won. Yeah. So I'm still exploring, and one way of thinking about it is with this acronym ASK, which I'm just in the middle of kind of developing, and it aligns with the story that I told about our patient, because he talked about, so it's about attending to self and other. It's about sharing stories and the shadow work, and it's around kindling hope. And I think if those three things are happening, I wonder, we're still exploring, but I wonder if that might make a flourishing space.
I really like the comparison you drew at the start to resilience, which is something that's come up in lots of conversations I've heard. And I remember the first time that people talk a lot about it in, I guess, a conversation about burnout as well, which is sometimes quite poorly defined and used, just, I guess, quite casually. But I remember hearing a very moving talk by a retired haematologist who'd spent his career looking after people in a particularly difficult situation, and he talked about coming to the end of his career and just, I think he said it was something like, some would have looked at the state that I was in and called it burnout, but to me it was the natural conclusion of like this role well lived. And there was something so moving about it to me of hearing, of being able to say, okay, in one sense, he was exhausted and he was expended. He'd expended himself on behalf of the people he was looking after, and he reached a point where he knew he couldn't keep doing that. But there's something kind of, the thing you said about resilience shaming kind of made me think of it, because there's something about the term burnout that implies you got it wrong along the way, or like either you weren't tough enough or you didn't have good enough boundaries or something like that. But I remember that his talks kind of stayed as a puzzle in my mind to think, well, could it be that for some of us we will reach points in our medical careers where we can't do it anymore, but that is a that's an honourable and actually quite beautiful way to have served in our lives. And I don't know exactly how Flourishing speaks to that, because there was something in how he spoke about it where he could look back and see the beauty and the commitment in what he'd done, rather than it was, I wasn't enough or whatever. And I don't know, I wonder if any of that kind of speaks to Flourishing versus resilience.
It speaks to Flourishing. It really does, because he's, it's just, give me the words again. He said it's a life.
It's like, he said it's something like, rather than, some might call it burnout, but to me it's the natural conclusion of this particular role, well lived.
Yeah. So that is, that is a real Flourishing perspective, isn't it? Seeing how, seeing a sense of the humanity and the energy expended and the hope and the, just taking that perspective on it, I think is a Flourishing mindset, if you like. And we might be more pushed into this idea of, burnout and failure, and it's a waste of time. But, it is a struggle, and life is a struggle for all. But, within medicine, it's a struggle. But to be able to be recognized and be satisfied and sort of have a sense of contentment in that, despite what others might say around, I think is very powerful, actually. And it's something that I want to go away and ponder on as well. But I would call that a Flourishing perspective.
I like that term contentment as well there, which I guess as well kind of doesn't, it's a bit of a misfit with resilience sometimes, because there's something about resilience that just means that you've got to kind of keep the tank flowing, but there might be that at some point you just reach contentment with being able to do what appears to be not so much, or you step back altogether, and that just being able to be content with that, there's something there.
I think there's something very powerful about that willingness to have expended himself on behalf of his patients, and that's all about meaning and purpose, I imagine. So, he's talking about a life that has been purposefully and meaningfully lived, even though it has been costly. And I imagine that he would look back and every time would do the same again. Another time, because he wants to live that meaningful, purposeful approach.
I think there's also something about the language that the Flourishing and that you're kind of alluding to that helps us tell better stories about where we are in our careers, as well as the spaces we're trying to provide for others to actually, because if one takes on the language of being not resilient enough and of burning out and of or whatever it is, then it can quite quickly strip meaning and it's almost casts everything in a very negative feeling light. Whereas, yeah, I think there's something here about, I don't know, making meaning out of where we find ourselves.
I think it's that, and it's not being, so it's not necessarily, so positive psychologists talk a lot about flourishing as well, and it's not necessarily, for me, it's not necessarily that either. It's not overly looking at the positive, because as I said earlier, the shadow work I think is one of the most important things. But in the shadow, there's something about connecting and accepting, you know, connecting with our humanity, connecting with others, accepting that and going on in it, that is so powerful and different in a way about the flourishing idea.
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to say on this idea of flourishing spaces?
No, I think just that we're still exploring it, and we're really keen to kind of explore with others, and part of our learning is through engaging with others, and so there's a lot more to be done.
Well, I'm so excited to see what's going to come out of your continuing explorations in flourishing spaces, in education, but in healthcare, in the medical and clinical spaces that we work in. Thank you, Louise, for coming and joining us on the podcast today.
You're welcome. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be back with another episode of Thinking in Between soon.